everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits and welcome to the 500th episode of Dyepot Weekly. I thought that we would keep things a little bit simple and fun today and do speckles in 4 different ways using the same colors each time. And for these 4 different ways, we're going to be using 2 different variables. One of them will be Countertop versus Immersion speckles, and then the other variable will be speckling with straight dye powder versus speckling with dye powder mixed with citric acid powder. And so if you take those 2 variables and combine them in all the ways you can, those are the 4 types of speckling we are doing today. Now, of course, there's many more ways that you can speckle yarn, but these are the 4 most frequent ways that I speckle yarn, and so well, let's go jump in. Today we are going to dye Knit Pick's Stroll fingering weight yarn. I figured this is the yarn base I've dyed the most of, so may as well use it for this milestone episode. And I've pre-soaked this yarn in some plain tap water for a couple of hours. But I do want to add some acid to it because, especially for our countertop technique where we're speckling with straight dye powder, we're going to need to add some acid to the yarn so that way those dyes strike. In this white bucket, I have 16 cups of water, which I don't think I've ever measured the water I've put in here. So we now know a little over half full is 16 cups, which I will absolutely forget later on. But let's add 6 tablespoons of white vinegar to this. 4, 5, 6. And the vinegar I use is 5% acetic acid. Okay, now I've squeezed most of the water out of 4 skeins. And I'm bringing this in. Technically, since we brought some water in, we did dilute the amount of acid a little bit, but it shouldn't be enough that it would make a huge difference. To our results here today. And I'm gonna add 2 more. And we're spilling a little bit of liquid. Things don't need to soak in here for very long, but the goal is just to add a little bit of acid into the yarn, so that way our dyes can strike. My work surface is protected with an IKEA shower curtain. But since I spilled that water on it, I will need to dry it off a little bit. Over time, I can get holes or things in here, they can get stained, but usually I only need to replace them once or twice a year, I think, unless I really cause damage to one. Today we're going to play with 3 different Dharma acid dyes. 2 colors that break into different colors, Lichen and Lilac, and then blued steel, which I forget if it breaks. It may break into multiple different colors, but either way, these are the colors that I'm planning to play with. And so I'm going to go over and get my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves so I can prepare the dyes mixed with citric acid. Whenever I'm dealing with dry dye powder, I'm always wearing a deluxe respirator mask. And this is to protect your lungs. You don't want to inhale any foreign materials into your lungs. Thankfully, I am happy to report that I don't think I've ever, when wiping down the rubber part of the mask, found dye on the mask. But still, I am going to take precautions. We don't need a ton of dye for our project today, but I want enough that I can hold it. So I'm going to use 1/2 teaspoon of a more finely milled citric acid powder, and then 2 or 3 little scoops of our acid dye. And then I'm going to stir things up together so it's really well mixed. The really finely like milled acid dye powder ends up sort of coating the crystals of citric acid. And these little scoops I think are 1/32 of a teaspoon. I think the citric acid I got from Dharma is more coarsely milled. This citric acid I'm using is a food grade, and I do have it linked down below because personally I like the finer milling and the way that it allows me to spread out the powders. Once I had all the dyes mixed up, I put lids on each of the containers and, well, we're ready to start our speckling journey. Okay, I've taken off my gloves so we can set up a little bit. I'll have 2 skeins off to the side. Those can be my yarn mops. And then here are the 2 skeins that we will use. And I think we may as well start with our non-citric acid speckles. And so you'll notice Then I'm taking the yarn and spreading it out. This way, as I speckle the powder on, some of it may go a little bit beneath the initial surface so we can get more coverage. But now let's put our protective gear back on and get ready. One thing that is incredibly important is you want your gloves to be dry before you go into the powder container. And so I'm going to pick up a little pinch of dye. You can see it's really not that much powder that I have in there. If you pick up too much, things will be like a lot more splotchy than speckles. And by using the straight dry powder, we could end up with some splotches. And so I like to start sometimes doing like just a line across, but you can also be a little bit more random and do like little dots here or there. The other nice thing that scrunching up the yarn does is it helps things be a little bit more random and a little bit less repeating, so that way you're not always going to have the same speckle in the same spot. All right, I'm going for the blued steel next. And again, to help, although actually I just realized because these are two different skeins, I think what I might do is do half like that, pinching up a little more on this side, going half over there. I'm trying again to not have everything be so perfectly repeating, a little bit random, but I also want decent coverage. I'm trying to treat things a little bit similarly. Now, one thing that this countertop technique is doing is, since we do not have additional water in the yarn, the colors can spread a little bit based on the amount of moisture that's in the yarn already, but there's a limit to that. And so you're not going to see as pastel of a backdrop. So this purple, this lilac, for example, is not going to spread out enough so that way you get a pale purple background. I mean, it could do a little bit, but it probably won't. The other thing that doing the straight dye powder speckles is that typically this makes it easier to see the speckles from far away, because you're looking at this and you don't really see the lilac as much right now, but I mean, I can see it. It's just slightly more hidden, going into some blank areas. Okay, you may not notice it quite as much right away, but you can visually see them very well. And sometimes when you can spread things more out with citric acid, it can be harder to see. You can end up with a more subtle speckled colorway. But I'm going to zoom you in. A lot of the purple hasn't sunk in yet, but you can see the speckles in all three areas. And in some cases, you get more of like a spot. In other cases where it's a little more together, you might see more of a larger splotch or a finer speck. Some of this depends on the actual colored pigment itself and how well I distribute it on the yarn. The higher up your fingers are from the yarn, the more things will spread, but I don't like to make a mess, so I tend to keep my hand just like 3 to 4 inches over the surface of the yarn. But now I'm going to give this, I think, just 5 minutes, and then I'm going to flip the yarn and add color to the other side. The really important thing I try to do when flipping the yarn over is to not rub it too much on the countertop. When I want to adjust the placement, I try to lift in place versus dragging it, because if you drag the yarn on the countertop, you can smear these speckles, giving you larger splotches, which is something that can be fun to do, and it's a really amazing, stunning effect. It just is not what we're going for right now. The reason why I'm waiting 5 minutes in between flips is just to give a little bit of time for the dye we've already added to sort of sink in, to dissolve into the water that's on the surface, and it gives it a little bit of a chance to bind to the yarn. Yes, we will still be heat setting it, but that little bit of time, I don't know, it doesn't hurt, certainly. So after I finished the second side, I again waited about 5 minutes before moving the yarn, likely one final time, adding color anywhere else I thought color was needed. And then I took the yarn and placed it inside a steamer basket to steam set this yarn for 30 minutes. And yes, we are introducing more liquid in the form of the steam, but we should still have some very bold speckles on our yarn. Okay, before we do the next type of speckles, I'm going to take a yarn mop and we're going to clean the counter up a bit. And I'm using just one of the yarn mops. The yarn mops may be pretty different in the end, but that's okay. Actually, I did stick these briefly inside the steamer basket, which I'll probably show when I remove the yarn, but it's just a pot with a steamer basket in it. That's what I use to steam set things. All right. I think the counter's pretty clean, and oh, I have these damp paper towels from earlier that I can also use to convince myself I have cleaned up most of the dye powder. There's just a little bit left before we go and do our next colors. Okay, here I am with our yarn. And once again, I'm going to spread it out. I didn't necessarily need that third flip because I was able to get really good coverage of those powders. But you'll notice that I did a very heavy speckled look on that first colorway. And we may still end up being slightly heavy speckled here as well. But once again, I'm taking a pinch of dye, just a little pinch on my gloved fingertips, and then sprinkling it on like maybe you would salt onto something. And I can go over the area again. When I'm doing this type of speckling, I might prefer to go over the same area more than once with less dye instead of going over with more dye and dropping it heavier. This helps just with the spread. And of course I'm starting with the lilac here, which I think is going to be the one that is the least visible of our colors. Now, unlike the other dry dye powders where I don't want to mix up the colors at all, and this is the blued steel, I don't need to wipe my glove off in between switching out the colors. And that's because there is a lot less pigment on my gloves than there was last time. And so the one thing you'll notice, and I'm not being that light with these speckles, but you'll probably notice that you're seeing a lot less color up at the vantage point where the camera is located. I'm coming in with the lichen, and that's just because I think overall you use a lot less dye when you're speckling like this, even if you are applying the color a little bit all over. I'm going really heavy with the lichen because it's not showing up very well. If your yarn is too dry when you do this, and you won't see the colors sink in, the lichen is starting to show up in places. But now I'm going to wipe my hand onto the yarn mop. A lot less color comes off this way. And here's a spot where we can see the lilac, the lichen, and the blued steel. And so all the colors are present, it's just way more subtle overall because we're able to spread the color out more. Now, I could use a lot more of the citric acid mixture to get an equivalent amount of dye, and you could pre-measure out the dye beforehand and play around with how far you can spread it. That's actually an interesting experiment idea. But even though we're speckling a similar amount all over, there's just less pigment, and that's why the colors aren't as intense. Once again, I waited between 4 and 5 minutes before flipping the yarn to add color to the other side. And since less pigment is being added with each flip, I feel like on the third flip this time, I really am gonna need to add color coverage, add more dye, just so that way we can have a similar all over feel with all of the yarn. And when you're mixing your dyes with the citric acid powder, if you want the speckles to be even more sparse and far apart, use more citric acid in relationship to the dye powder. If you have the volume of dye powder and the volume of citric acid powder, equal, then you won't get as much spread from when you're speckling. And once again, if you raise your arms higher, then it is easier to spread out the dye, but then you just risk spreading the dye beyond your work surface, which probably isn't what you want. Once I was satisfied with the coverage on our second countertop technique and colorway, I took this yarn over to a second steamer basket to steam set the yarn for 30 minutes. And then I brought over one or other of the yarn mops to wipe the dye up off of the countertop. How sharp of speckles you end up with depends on how much acid is present, but also on the pigment itself. If you have a color that is one that tends to bleed, say an emerald green or a hot fuchsia kind of color, then the colors will spread more and you won't end up with speckles that are as sharp, especially if there's no citric acid mixed in with those speckles right away. Because another plus of having citric acid present is since that is acid and it dissolves, it'll make that little area a little bit more acidic, and so in theory could help colors strike faster. But I haven't explored this specifically a ton. You can mix your dyes with other powders. I've done salt and sugar in the past, and there is no doubt that the colors with the citric acid do strike a little bit faster than using those other two powders. But anyway, I'm digressing a little bit. I really just wanted to point out that the type of pigment that you're using can change your results. And so if you want a specific type of results with your speckles, I recommend testing out a mini skein first to just see what happens. But also keep in mind that different fiber contents and different fiber blends may speckle differently. And so it's always possible you can do a little bit of testing. The 30 minutes are up on one of our steamer baskets. And I'm now going to remove our countertop speckled yarn. You see speckles here? So there are some areas of large splotches. I went heavy, but especially with the lichen, you can see some beautiful breaking, which really highlights those speckles. And I'm gonna set this aside to cool before we wash it. And right back there are the other countertop speckles. And I'm gonna bring over our intermediate yarn mops. And while we're waiting with one of our immersion colorways, this is just gonna sit in here with the lid on for, 3 minutes or so. Give it a little bit of heat. It hasn't hit a point where dye is coming back on my gloves. I suppose if this is one of your first videos of mine I'm watching, I didn't define a yarn mop. A yarn mop is a bonus skein of yarn that I use to wipe excess dye off of countertops and off of my gloves. And it's a way to get a really beautiful, soft colorway that is a bonus. But anyway, once I'm done with all the dyeing, the yarn mop will heat set in a steamer basket for 30 minutes. I just realized here in the middle of the video that I've not labeled any of my zip ties. So we'll have to see how things go. Okay, we're gonna do the immersion with citric acid speckles next. Bringing over our yarn. All right, and I've got some water that is 8 cups of water with 3 tablespoons of white vinegar. Don't know how much of this I'm gonna use. Probably used 5.5 cups of that water. That gives us a nice layer of water on the bottom, but our yarn is still sort of a little bit above the surface. And I really do just estimate that. Okay, and now I'm gonna turn on the burners so we can heat things up, and once everything is nice and steamy, we can put the respirator mask back on and start speckling. Okay, we're very steamy. I reduced the heat to low. It can be annoying to speckle with too much steam because the powders, your gloves will start to get damp and the powders can start to stick. But I'm coming in with the lichen, and I'm trying to speckle with a similar amount of powder to what I had used for the countertop. But I think you might notice that you're seeing the colors show up. Whoop, that was a larger splotch, a lot faster. And that's because with it warm, things are dissolving a little bit faster. It does look like, I'm seeing in here a fair amount of a dark blue. I'm wondering if I really contaminated our green before, which is fine. Not a problem, because those are all colors we're using, but it's pretty funny that I'm seeing so much, potentially, of the blued steel. Now, Lichen and Lilac are both much more pastel colors. And what I mean by that, well, they also both break, and so, but I have a feeling that what we're seeing here is a result of having some blued steel accidentally mixed in from my fingertips, so that is what it is. But by having a color that is more of a pastel, like the Lilac or the Lichen, that means that there's just less pigment in there overall. Alright, and I added some of our blued steel. And now when I zoom in, you can see a lot of fine specks of our three colors here. Yeah, maybe there's some streaks, but things seem to be striking pretty quickly. However, we're going to wait 5 minutes and then we will flip the yarn and see if we observe anything. As we're about to flip the yarn, I think it is worth mentioning that I did not add this to the pre-soak with vinegar before we started, but we did add that same proportion of vinegar to water that we used with our countertop yarn, just in case you're curious. I'm going to use my tongs, and I do remove some water as I'm flipping. And okay, you know, I see a tiny bit of spread over there around some of the blue, a tiny bit of pastel spread, but overall, I think we've got a low enough level of water that I'm not seeing a ton of spread of the colors when we flip, which is good. That's not bad. Okay, but anyway, let's carry on. When I was doing the countertop speckles, I did wait before flipping, but it really wasn't that big of a deal if I didn't wait as long. Now that we are in an immersion situation, waiting is a little bit more important, because if you add the speckles on and then immediately flip the yarn, you will get a lot more spread of color than if you give it that time to sort of dissolve and set in place before flipping. And so this is something that can be really fun to do if you want to have sort of a tonal yarn with really subtle speckles. You could speckle on and just move things constantly to get that spread. And so again, you mess around with any of the variables, the time, the heat, the acidity, and you could get slightly different or very different results. It really just depends on what you're going for. So I did wait. I tried to wait at least 5 minutes in between flipping the colors. And then once I was satisfied with the color coverage and had waited, you know, that 5 minutes of time, I added some more water with the same 8 cups of water to 3 tablespoons of white vinegar ratio, and heat set this yarn so it would have had a total of 30 minutes of heat from the last time I added dye. My overhead light did run out of batteries during the process, but I would say that we are done now. So I'm going to turn off the heat, and then I'm going to use my tongs to remove the excess liquid. And I would say that the background doesn't really feel white. It feels slightly grayish to me. But anyway, I'm going to set this aside to cool so we can wash it. And we're going to clean the pan and reset so we can do our immersion colorway with the straight acid dye powder. Oh, and in the dyeing process, I did use up the majority of the citric acid dyes I mixed, but there is still a little left over that I'll save for an eventual leave no dye behind project. Okay, it's getting a little darker. This particular version with our low immersion using the straight dye powder is going to require more yarn mop usage than the last one. All right, I'm going to attempt to once again go for about, 5.5-ish cups of water, because that was a really good amount. Because you can see when I pull it away, there's still water here, but we have our yarn at the surface. I'm going to add a tiny bit more, and we'll heat things up, and then come start dyeing the yarn. Woo! That is steamy. All right, let it de-steam a little bit. Put all my gear back on so we can start dyeing. Okay, I'm coming in with the Lichen first. And once again, I'm pinching up a small amount. And you can see that looks speckly. I'll zoom in a minute. It's still very steamy. It's all about how much you can actually get the colors to spread out. Because just from wiping my fingers without holding much dye, we got some speckling there. But you can also go for more discreet spots if you choose. Sometimes it really just depends a bit on how the colors ultimately spread. Because here, as I'm speckling this, we are getting some smaller speckles, but also some bigger chunks of color. And so on one hand, things can strike a little bit faster because we've got the heat, they're dissolving faster, and I'm not moving the yarn as soon. But on the other hand, since there's more water, the colors can spread more. And the spread isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just the reality of the situation. Now, I think that in many circumstances, what I like to do is to make chunky speckles in a couple of colors and then have a more neutral color, which in this case would be like this blued steel, to come in with that. Ooh. You can see we got a lot in there now. Whoops. To come in with the blued steel that's mixed with citric acid, so then I can spread it a little bit more. When we zoom in, you can see some big patches. We do have some itty bitty little speckles, but I have a feeling this time when we flip, we might see a little bit more spread. But again, we'll wait and see. And so I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes. Before we go ahead and flip, just in case, to give this dye a chance to not only dissolve, but to really strike where we've placed it. Before we flip the yarn, there's one other thing I really want to quickly add, and that is whenever I'm not actively using the dye, I put the lid back on. And if you're nervous about the water level getting low, I like to come around with a turkey baster. This is some more of this water with vinegar, and just add a little bit around the edge. Where are my tongs? Ah, this is what I get for cleaning things. Okay, I'm gonna squeeze out the water. So you can see that almost, I mean, there's a tiny bit of color on the side. Most of the color is in the yarn, but this time you can see that we have some color that has come through on the other side. And so that is going to be one of the biggest differences between doing this low immersion and doing this on the countertop. On the countertop, we'll have less of this pastel backdrop. And now, let's carry on. I feel like I'm going a little heavy-handed on this one, but I'm really enjoying these colors together and the pigmentation. I do regret that my magnetic LED bar light isn't working because I feel like you can't get all of the glory that we have here, but it is beautiful. And I feel like it's gonna require fewer flips overall, especially compared to when I was using the citric acid speckles low immersion, because those were striking faster and not really going much through more than one strand. But anyway, I did wait at least 5 minutes in between each flip. And then once I was satisfied with the color, I added the rest of the water with vinegar that we had made at the beginning and let things heat for 30 minutes from the last time I added dye. And as for the yarn mops, I then went and steam set those for 30 minutes, which I think I had already told you that I was going to do. And I can't sing the songs that are stuck in my head because I'd get a copyright claim. But here we go. Beautiful, beautiful. All right, I'm gonna set her aside to cool, and then we can go start washing our yarn. Today, I'm really only showcasing 4 different speckling techniques, but there are other ways you can go about this. You could start with a liquid dye and get a paintbrush or an eyedropper and add and literally hand paint on little specks. And even if you mix these colors with, say, guar gum, then the colors won't spread out very more, and this can give you a very controlled placement of your colors. Of course, that is more time consuming. I've also used things like a fork dipped in powder or liquid to sort of speckle onto yarn. That also gives some slightly larger speckles. But ultimately, I think it all comes down to preference, and different dyers will have different way they like to do things. I think that these 4 ways are 4 of the most frequently used speckling techniques, but I suppose I also haven't asked a bunch of other dyers to see if they do something different. I know a lot of dyers, instead of using their fingertips, which I'm doing in all of these examples, will add their dyes into some kind of salt shaker or dusting wand or spoon to spread out the dye. And so that application method absolutely can vary, but the thing in common is frequently the dry dye powders. But anyway, let's get back to our yarn. Okay, we're gonna wash our countertop yarn now, and it's still a little warm, so I'm breaking one of my rules, but since this yarn is superwash, as I add some dish soap, I am less concerned about it being completely cool when I go and wash it. And I did go ahead and label the zip ties. So A is our first countertop speckles, B would be our second. But just even briefly, there are differences, but they can feel more subtle in spaces. It just depends. And ultimately, the amount of dye that I add on will make a difference in how things feel as well. But I'm not seeing any bleeding here, which always makes me really excited. So I'm gonna go ahead and rinse out the soap, put all this yarn through the spin dryer to hang it up to dry, and then, well, we'll come back and wash our immersion yarn. But technically at this point in the video, I've only dyed the citric acid speckled one. I haven't dyed the other one yet. Coming in with the remaining 6 skeins. We've got our yarn mops, our immersion non-citric acid speckles, and then we have our immersion citric acid speckles, which felt like had a ton of pigment, but compared to the non-citric acid, I feel like there's a lot less. All right, this is gonna be a little heavy. Now, I'm less worried about bleeding here because since we were full immersion, there was a chance for dye to dissolve because it was submerged. Sometimes when you do countertop speckles, you can get bleeding at the wash stage because there could be some dye still on the surface that never dissolved. So it doesn't mean that the dye, well, I mean, that dye wasn't set well, but it doesn't mean that the yarn, once it's washed, would be a bleeder. It just means that you need to rinse out that dye on the surface. But seeing none of those problems here. Yeah, there is no color in that water. So now, I just need to finish rinsing out the soap, put all the yarn through my spin dryer, and hang it up to dry. And here we have our 4 types of speckled yarn, where we have our citric acid speckles, our straight powder speckles, and then countertop and low immersion. Comparing the countertop colorways, we have a lot more pigmentation here, even though we still have some beautiful fine speckles. And here we have fine speckles that do have spread in some places, but overall the yarn is a lot less pigmented. And this is something that could be remedied by using the same amount of dye with or without citric acid, but using like a similar technique, being able to spread the dye out more with the citric acid, it has a little bit less of a punch. The speckles are a little sharper and more subtle. Here we have our 2 citric acid colorways. We have the countertop and then low immersion. And the biggest difference between the two is that the low immersion colorway, the speckles are slightly bigger, slightly punchier, but then also the background is a very slight pastel. The white or the off-white of the background on this yarn right here is still more white because the colors didn't spread and dissolve into the entire dye bath. And we see a similar thing when we look at the countertop versus immersion speckles when we use the straight dye powder. The speckles are chunky, and we have actually, I think, more of the fine speckles on our immersion colorway because they can strike quickly. and there's a little bit less spread from just the movement. Like in here, you can see some spread, but some of that color did dissolve into the liquid, and so we have sort of this pastel blue that goes overall in the background. Comparing our immersion colorways without citric acid and with citric acid, I would say that there's more of a background color when we dyed the yarn without having the citric acid speckles, but this really depends on how quickly you move it, how much water is there, and also overall the fact that I was adding more dye when I had the straight dye powder. All of these differences are ultimately really subtle, and the technique that you choose depends a lot on how much you're able to spread the dye out, and so you may have preferences over which ones you like the best. But again, don't forget that the actual dye colors and pigments that you are picking can impact how much or how little the colors spread out and what you see in your finished yarn. Our two yarn mops have both more pigment and less pigment than some of these colorways. Because of the way you wipe dye off of your gloves onto the mops or wipe it off the counter, things may blend more and get a little bit more blown out. So you can end up with speckles on a colorway like this, but these particular colorways I wouldn't personally refer to as speckled. I'm hoping some of the differences come through on camera with the yarn twisted up. But here we have our Countertop no citric acid, Countertop with citric acid, Immersion with citric acid, and Immersion with the straight dye powder. I would say the most subtle differences that we have between any of them would be between our two citric acid colorways. With these particular colors, the spread that we had when we were Immersion was fairly minimal, and so I feel like you could almost blend all these together, but the background here is slightly different, and so it would, if you went straight from here to here, I think you would notice a difference. And one last time, let's take a close look at all of the speckles from the 4 different variations we used today. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I cannot believe that this is episode number 500 of Dyepot Weekly. It feels like forever ago when I started the series at the end of 2017. Oh my goodness. And here we are in 2024. Wow. And I feel like I still have so many colors and techniques and dye types to explore. But when I think about where I am now versus where I was back at episode 1, I know that I've grown so much as a dyer. And I truly hope that these videos have been helpful. And a huge thank you to all of you for joining me on this journey and joining me in my exploration of color and yarn. If there's anything that you would like to see, please let me know in the comments below. I do try to keep track of suggestions and draw from them frequently as I go and make new videos. Please make sure you're subscribed and have your notifications turned on. This is the biggest way that you can help support all of the content here. But if you're looking for some other ways to help support the content on the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel, I have a Patreon and I have a shop, ChemKnits Creations, that is full of hand-dyed yarn that has been featured in my videos, and including in a new restock yarn that is featured in this video that you are watching right now. And I suggest that you take a look at the video description because I think in honor of our 500th episode, there is a special coupon code that you might want to check out. I should have it both as a pinned comment down below in the comment section, but also it'll be at the top of the video description. So that way you can go and get a lovely discount off of yarn that has been featured in some of my videos. And now stay tuned because coming up over the next few weeks, we've got some over dyeing projects, some sock blanks, some roving, and more. And I really hope you're gonna love all of it. Thank you so much for watching.